He never sold drugs. He never laundered money. He never defrauded anyone. And yet, the federal government seized every dollar in his bank account, $107,000, and charged him with a federal felony. Here's a question for you. What if I told you that the way you withdraw your own money, money you earned legally, money you've already paid taxes on, could get you arrested? Not because you did something wrong, not because you're hiding anything, but because of a rule so obscure, so counterintuitive, and so aggressively enforced that thousands of ordinary Americans, retirees, small business owners, farmers, restaurant owners, have had their life savings seized without ever being charged with the underlying crime it was designed to prevent. The rule is called structuring, and the trap is almost perfectly designed to catch innocent people. Here's the part that will really unsettle you. The threshold that triggers this law is $10,000. That's it. And to avoid triggering a bank report, some people, completely on their own, with no criminal intent, decide to make slightly smaller deposits or withdrawals, like $9,500 or $9,800 or $9,999. That instinct, that completely rational, innocent instinct to stay under the radar, is, according to federal law, a felony. Today, we're going to trace exactly how this happened, how a law designed to catch drug lords became a weapon against grandmothers, how the government seized billions from people who were never convicted of any crime, and how the system, once built, became almost impossible to dismantle. Stay with me, because the twists in this story don't end where you think they do. To understand the structuring trap, you need to go back to the early 1970s, when Congress was staring down a crisis it didn't quite know how to solve. Organized crime was booming. Drug trafficking networks were generating hundreds of millions of dollars in cash every year. And that cash had to go somewhere. Into the banking system, into real estate, into shell companies. The problem was, banks weren't asking questions. You could walk into a branch with a suitcase of money, deposit it, and the bank would simply bank it. So in 1970, Congress passed the Bank Secrecy Act, which, despite its name, is actually an anti-secrecy law. It required financial institutions to file a currency transaction report, or CTR, for any cash transaction over $10,000. The logic was simple: give law enforcement a paper trail. If drug dealers are moving cash, make the banks document it. It seemed reasonable. It seemed targeted. It seemed like exactly the kind of tool the government needed. But here's the thing about giving law enforcement a new tool. They will use it. And the people it was designed to catch, they adapt. Within a few years, criminal organizations figured out the $10,000 threshold, and they started doing something very simple, breaking large cash transactions into smaller ones, each just under $10,000, to avoid triggering the reports. This practice became known as smurfing, named after the idea of small, numerous, seemingly harmless characters doing big work. Congress's response came in 1986 with an amendment buried inside the Money Laundering Control Act. The amendment made it a federal crime not just to launder money, but to structure transactions specifically to avoid triggering a CTR. And that, right there, is where everything started to go wrong. On paper, the structuring law was a surgical strike. Target the behavior, deliberately breaking up transactions, not the underlying cash. If a drug dealer wanted to avoid a CTR by making 10 deposits of $9,900, that act itself would be criminal, regardless of whether you could prove the drug dealing. Smart, efficient, surgical. Except for one word that Congress chose to leave out: intent. In most criminal laws, to be found guilty, you have to have criminal intent, what lawyers call mens rea, or guilty mind. You have to know you're doing something wrong. You have to mean to do it. The structuring statute, as written, did not clearly require the government to prove that you knew structuring was illegal. It required only that you deliberately broke up the transactions, even if you had a perfectly innocent reason for doing so. Think about what that means. A farmer who doesn't trust large checks and prefers to deposit cash in chunks. A restaurant owner who makes daily deposits to manage cash flow. An elderly woman who was always told never to carry too much money. A small business owner who simply read online that deposits over $10,000 can cause problems at the bank. None of them are criminals. None of them have dirty money, and yet, under a strict reading of the statute, all of them could be charged. For the first decade or so, this wasn't a massive problem because federal prosecutors largely focused the law on its intended targets, people who were also committing other financial crimes. If you were structuring to hide drug proceeds, great, 2 charges instead of 1. But then came the expansion of civil asset forfeiture, and that changed everything. You need to understand civil asset forfeiture to understand why the structuring trap became so devastating, because these are 2 separate legal mechanisms that, when combined, created something that looks less like law enforcement and more like a government shakedown. Civil asset forfeiture is a legal process that allows the government to seize property it believes was connected to a crime, without convicting or even charging the owner. The case is technically against the property, not the person, which is why you get court case names like United States for $107,702.96 in U.S. currency. The money itself is the defendant. Now, the original intent was reasonable. Stop drug dealers from profiting from their crimes, even if you couldn't convict them. But over time, the program transformed. Here's why. The agencies that seized the assets got to keep a large share of them. The DEA, the IRS, the FBI, they received direct funding from the proceeds of forfeiture. They were, in a very real sense, financially incentivized to seize assets. And when you combine that incentive with the structuring law, which doesn't require proving the underlying crime, only the pattern of deposits, you get a machine that practically runs itself. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division started flagging bank accounts with suspicious deposit patterns that looked like structuring. And because the structuring law didn't require criminal intent to be proven for the forfeiture, agents could seize accounts based on deposit records alone. No drugs, no fraud, no theft, just the pattern. This is when the stories started piling up. Case study: Carol Hinders. Carol Hinders ran a small Mexican restaurant in Iowa for 38 years. She paid her suppliers in cash, not because she was hiding anything, but because they preferred it. Her bank, aware of the $10,000 threshold, had actually suggested she keep deposits under that amount to avoid the extra paperwork. So she did, and the IRS noticed the pattern. In 2013, they seized her entire business account, $33,000. They never charged her with structuring. They never accused her of drug dealing, money laundering, or any other underlying crime. They simply took the money. She spent 2 years fighting in court to get it back. She eventually did, but not everyone does. Case study: the Hirsch brothers. Brothers, Jeff and Richard Hirsch, ran a small candy and snack food distributor in Long Island. Their customers paid in cash. The brothers made regular cash deposits, nearly always under $10,000, because that's what their accountant told them to do to avoid triggering extra bank attention. Federal prosecutors seized their entire operating account, over $446,000. The brothers were forced to halt operations. They fought for months. The government eventually returned the money, but only after the business had been effectively strangled. And these are not isolated cases. The Institute for Justice, a nonprofit law firm, documented over 2,500 structuring seizures by the IRS between 2005 and 2012. In 91% of those cases, the money came from legal sources. The government kept it anyway. In the early 1990s, the structuring debate finally reached the United States Supreme Court in a case called Ratzlaff versus United States. And for a brief moment, it looked like common sense might win. Waldemar Ratzlaff had accumulated a $160,000 gambling debt at a casino in Nevada. To pay it off, he structured cash payments below $10,000, clearly aware he was avoiding bank reports. The government charged him with criminal structuring. The question before the Supreme Court was this: does the government need to prove that Ratzlaff knew that structuring was illegal? Not just that he structured? In a 5-4 decision, the court said yes. To convict someone of structuring, the government must prove they knew it was unlawful to structure, not merely that they intended to avoid the report. It was a win for civil liberties. It closed the gap that allowed innocent people to be criminally prosecuted. But Congress, furious at the ruling, amended the statute within 2 years to essentially reverse it. The 1996 amendment clarified that for criminal prosecution, knowledge of illegality was required. But the standard remained far murkier for civil forfeiture, where the burden of proof is lower and the government's incentive to seize is higher. The machine kept running. By the 2010s, the structuring trap had quietly spread into every corner of ordinary American financial life. And a new demographic was getting caught: retirees. Here's why retirees are particularly vulnerable. Many of them grew up in an era of financial caution. They remember bank runs, the Great Depression's shadow, warnings to never put all your eggs in one basket. They often distrust the banking system in a general, low-level way. They prefer to move money in smaller amounts. They avoid what they perceive as red tape. And many of them, particularly those running small cash businesses or managing estate accounts, make regular deposits just under $10,000. They're not criminals. They're cautious. But the bank's algorithm doesn't know the difference. And here's the nightmare layer. Under civil forfeiture rules, once the government seizes your money, you have to prove it was innocent. The burden of proof is reversed. You're guilty until proven innocent. And proving innocence costs money you may no longer have. The average cost to fight a forfeiture case is between $10,000 and $30,000 in legal fees. If the government seized $15,000 from you, do the math. Many people simply don't fight. They can't afford to. So they let the government keep their money, which is, of course, exactly what the system has been designed to enable. The Institute for Justice found that between 2007 and 2016, the IRS seized more than $1.4 billion through structuring cases alone, and roughly a third of it came from people with no criminal charges filed against them. Not arrested, not indicted, not convicted, just seized. After a wave of media coverage in 2014 and 2015, driven largely by reporting from the New York Times and advocacy from the Institute for Justice, Congress finally acted. The 2015 reform required the IRS to only pursue structuring cases where there was evidence of an underlying crime or clear criminal intent. In theory, this meant agents couldn't seize money from innocent business owners simply because their deposit pattern looked suspicious. And for a while, it helped. The number of purely civil structuring seizures dropped significantly. But here's the catch. The reform didn't change the law itself. It changed IRS policy. Policy can be reversed. Policy can be narrowly interpreted. When other agencies, the DEA, local law enforcement, through federal equitable sharing programs, weren't necessarily bound by the same guidance. Furthermore, the $10,000 threshold has never been adjusted for inflation. In 1970, $10,000 was roughly equivalent to $80,000 today. Nearly no ordinary person in 1970 routinely handled $10,000 in cash. Today, a single home repair, a car purchase, a slow week of restaurant revenue, $10,000 is not an extraordinary amount, which means the net catches far more ordinary people than it ever was designed to. The machine, in other words, wasn't rebuilt, it was patched. If you think this is a relic, a problem mostly fixed, mostly contained to a few dramatic cases from the 2010s, I want to show you why that's exactly the wrong conclusion. First, the cryptocurrency parallel. Today, regulators are applying the same structuring logic to crypto transactions. Breaking up crypto trades into amounts below reporting thresholds is increasingly being flagged by blockchain analytics firms working for law enforcement. The technology changes, the trap doesn't. Second, the global spread. The United States model of currency transaction reports has been exported through the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, to over 200 countries, which means the structuring trap isn't just American. In Canada, the UK, Australia, and dozens of other nations, similar laws have been used to seize assets from small businesses and ordinary citizens. Third, the Bank Secrecy Act generates over 24 million CTRs per year. That's 24 million reports on cash transactions, flooding law enforcement with data they cannot possibly review meaningfully. The signal-to-noise ratio is catastrophic. In 2020, BuzzFeed News and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists published the FinCEN files, thousands of leaked suspicious activity reports, and found that the vast majority of flagged transactions were from ordinary people and businesses. Meanwhile, truly large-scale money laundering by global banks continued relatively undisturbed. The system designed to catch the most dangerous financial criminals is, structurally, better at catching the least dangerous ones. Let's land this plane. 3 things you need to take away from this video. Takeaway 1, the $10,000 threshold is real, and so is the trap. But knowledge is your best protection. If you regularly deal in cash, if you're a small business owner, a landlord, a retiree managing estate funds, you need to understand what structuring is. Specifically, you should never deliberately break up transactions to stay under $10,000. If you have a legitimate reason for a large cash transaction, make it. Let the CTR be filed. A CTR is not an accusation, it is a report. It generates no immediate consequence for you. Fighting that instinct to stay under the radar is counterintuitive, but it is legally safer. Takeaway 2, if your account is seized, do not wait and hope it resolves itself. The forfeiture process has strict deadlines. In many cases, you have as few as 35 days to file a claim contesting the seizure. Miss that window, and you may permanently lose your right to contest it. If this happens to you or someone you know, contact a civil asset forfeiture attorney immediately. Organizations like the Institute for Justice have provided free representation in high-profile cases. Takeaway 3, the system isn't broken. It's working as it evolved to work. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable takeaway. The structuring trap isn't a mistake or an oversight. It is the predictable result of a law with weak intent requirements, combined with financial incentives for seizure, combined with a forfeiture burden of proof that favors the government. Reforms have been partial. The incentives have not fundamentally changed. Understanding that this is structural, not accidental, is the first step to demanding real reform. There's one more thing I want to leave you with. In 2019, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Timms versus Indiana that the Eighth Amendment's protection against excessive fines applies to the states, and that civil asset forfeiture can, under certain circumstances, constitute an unconstitutional fine. It was a landmark ruling, and it changed almost nothing in practice, because the machinery of civil forfeiture and the structuring trap doesn't rest on one legal ruling. It rests on decades of statutes, agency policies, budget allocations, and institutional incentives. You don't dismantle that with a single court case. So here's the question I'll leave you with. At what point does a law designed to protect the public from criminals become itself a mechanism of harm against the people it was supposed to protect? And more practically, how many people right now are sitting in their kitchen worried about a bank letter they received, not knowing they have days, not months, going to respond? The structuring trap doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a warning label. It comes quietly in the form of a federal notice sent to an address attached to a bank account that's already been frozen. Know the law, protect yourself. And share this video, because the person who most needs to see it probably doesn't know to search for it. If this video helped you understand something that most people never learn until it's too late, hit subscribe. We cover exactly this kind of topic: the hidden mechanics of financial systems, the laws that quietly shape your life, the stories behind the headlines. And if you want to go deeper, I've linked below to the Institute for Justice's full report on structuring seizures, the original New York Times investigative series that helped spark the 2015 reform, and a plain English breakdown of your rights if your bank account is ever frozen. The best defense against a trap is knowing it exists. I'll see you in the next one.